Roger,
Yeah,
welcome to Troy. You're
can you
on.
hear me okay? Am I on? God. Yeah, great. Can everyone hear me okay? Is this about right? Yeah, well, thank you very much for coming to this evening. And obviously my apologies that due to forces outside my control, as you might say, I'm not actually physically there. So unfortunately, you've got me in my friend's kitchen at 12:30 in the morning instead. So yeah, I hope this Zoom call is going to go okay. If you don't know, I'm feeling a little bit battered because it's felt like jumping through a bunch of hoops to actually get to speak to you tonight. I was stopped from coming to America by the British courts because I'm under a charge for creating conspiracy at Heathrow Airport. So that was a little bit of a problem. So I got over that one, and then your Homeland Security people decided that I needed to get a visa. So that was a little bit. That's basically why I'm still here. And then from the other side of the equation, there's been various people sort of saying I should be speaking about this or not speaking about that, or speaking on behalf of these people and not those people. So I just want to clarify that I'm speaking in a personal capacity. I've never sought to speak on behalf of anyone or presume that I'm speaking on behalf of anyone, not least Extinction Rebellion. Though obviously as a co-founder and someone that's done a lot of work for it, I will be talking about it in some detail this evening. Yeah, so yeah, I feel a little bit, what's the word? I feel a bit presumptuous that as an English person, I'm sort of coming over to America to tell Americans what I've learned from America. Because like a lot of the ideas around Extinction Rebellion have basically been inspired by the American tradition. So it seems a little bit like presumptuous of me coming over to tell you what you probably already know. But I'm sort of going to do that anyway. And I've sort of got this feeling that you probably know most of the things I'm going to say, but you've sort of come tonight to hear what you sort of want to hear anyway, because we need to hear some things quite a few times before you actually get up and do stuff. So there will be a little Q&A session, I think, but also there should be a chance for some of you guys to say what's happening in your locality. And at the end of the day, that's the main issue here, I think, is not coming to another talk about an interesting, slant on the climate crisis and then everyone goes home again. We've been doing that for 30 years. As far as I'm concerned, the name of the game is to actually inspire ourselves to act and be responsible as human beings and citizens and what have you. I have got this book. I'm really not entirely bothered whether you read it or not, to be honest. So I'm supposed to be going on a book tour, but I'm not very good at book tours. I've never done a book tour before. So the main thing that I want to talk about is, what the fuck needs to happen. And if you want to buy the book, that's great. But as it happens, like, it's called Common Sense. And as I'm sure you probably know, this guy called Thomas Paine came to America just before the American Revolution. And I'm sort of inspired by him because I think he was a bit of an upstart Englishman. And he was only in America for 7 months, apparently. And then he wrote this book called Common Sense, telling the good American public that the best thing they should do is get rid of the British Crown, which I happen to agree with, even though I'm on the other side of the pond. And I think the general idea was most Americans sort of knew this was necessary, but they had to have a sort of upstart Englishman who didn't know anything about America to come and tell them. And for me, the sort of moral of the tale is that sometimes you need people outside your community to actually tell you a few sort of basic rights and wrongs, as it were. So maybe I'm inspired by that. Yeah, and as far as the book is concerned, yeah, I'm sort of obviously keen to read it, but I think you probably know the score that there's these book tours, and one of the reasons I don't like book tours is you know, someone promotes the book and then you read the book and you say, well, that was great. And I'm not really interested in this idea that everything's fine and you read the book and you put it down and then you carry on. I'm more interested in the idea that everything's in a complete mess and you can read this book and then that's going to help you deal with this complete mess. So I want to say, I'm just going to talk generally. I'm not going to do a big barnstorming speech. I hope you're going to be able to cope. I'm going to talk generally about a few themes, and then if you want to ask some questions, that would be great. And I'm going to talk to you on the basis of my own experience and also being one of the sort of people at the strategic heart of Extinction Rebellion in the UK and what that experience has been like. But I want to start by acknowledging the situation as I understand it in Troy. And I was talking to one of you guys yesterday and you're saying, you know, it's quite a post-industrial sort of landscape in New York State and used to be quite rich or whatever, and it's not anymore. And a lot of people feel sort of lost and confused and betrayed, and that general feeling that things are not as they're supposed to be, that a lot of people are poor and a lot of people are very rich. And this has been going on for decades now, and it's not been getting any better. And I am also from an area in the north of England. I was brought up in the 1980s when Mrs. Thatcher was Prime Minister. And as some of you may know, like that was the time when there was massive deindustrialization of North England. And there was very much a similar feeling of injustice and of being betrayed by the government so that some people could benefit at the cost of many other people. And for the last 20 years, I've been a farmer in West Wales, which is a fairly poor area of the UK. And that's been under massive economic pressure as well. And many of the farmers in West Wales, they work 70, 80 hours a week. They earn about probably equivalent of about $150 a week. They don't really have a time for families. A lot of them never manage to get married, a lot of the men who run these farms. And they're in a real mess. So I want to sort of acknowledge that that's the background on which we've now discovered the climate crisis, or what's called a climate crisis. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But I'm going to make a few propositions. So I'm going to, I want to emphasize, like, you can take whatever you like from what I say, you know, but I'm going to make a few proposals and arguments to you. And I'm hoping that you'll take what you want from them. You know, maybe you'll agree with some and maybe you won't. But I'm not going to do a sort of talk where I'm trying to say things where we're all going to agree necessarily. But there's no pressure. So the first proposition I'm going to make, and this is my first sort of challenge, I suppose, is this idea that it's only going to be like relatively middle-class people that are going to lead this revolution or this rebellion against the atrocities that are coming down the road. My proposition is that it's actually going to be ordinary people. And by ordinary people, I don't actually mean activists. I don't mean people from all the familiar sort of progressive social movements that are going to lead this rebellion against the destruction of our world and our children. It's going to be hundreds of thousands of ordinary people. And by ordinary people, I mean people that are without much money, who aren't particularly interested in politics, that just want a quiet life, that just want to get on with stuff. And interestingly enough, I had this sort of idea for a while, and I said last summer when I did a lot of speeches around the UK, I said, I don't want to talk to all the trendy, you know, inner city hipster sort of areas. I want to go to normal everyday towns and cities, I guess similar to Troy and what have you, places that have been neglected, not particularly like high up on people's agendas. So I went around some of these small towns. And interestingly enough, I found that it was in these small towns and where people were most animated, where people got most emotional about what's going on. And my idea around this is it's in the places where people have really suffered and people really know what it is to have a hard life, that people understand how much harder it's going to be when this shit comes down the line as it is now. And the other idea I've got is that they're not so frightened. You know, there's that phrase, I think from America, which is when you've got freedoms having nothing left to lose, something along those lines, or at least you haven't got so much skin in the game. So that's a big challenge because obviously traditionally the environmental movement's been very middle class, very urban and what have you. But I think there's good evidence now to show that we're potentially looking at what you might call a universal like rebellion or social movement. I'll say a little bit more about that as I go along. Okay, so I'm going to say a little bit about, well, the person that introduced me said I'm going to be talking about mobilization. So I am going to be talking about mobilization, and that's what I sort of specialize in. That's what I do sort of strategic thinking around and organizing in the UK. And it's what I've done 5 years of research on at King's College as PhD research, which is mainly being like field work, as they call it. But that's just like a posh word for going out and actually doing real things rather than sitting in libraries. So I started off doing, you know, stuff around rent strikes and organising casualised migrant labour in London and what have you, before I progressed onto the climate crisis. And one of the things that I want to propose is that it is important to actually tell people exactly what's happening. One of the weird things I found when I entered the climate change world is a lot of activists never actually talked about what the climate crisis was. And there's this idea that you put people off by facts and figures and stuff. But I'd like to propose, and this is my next proposal, is that people actually need to know exactly how fucked this situation is, using that word. In other words, in everyday language, because the environmental movement, as far as I'm concerned, one of the reasons why it's been so unsuccessful, in so much as it hasn't enabled any major changes to happen on the climate situation, is because it's far too polite and it uses euphemisms, and it doesn't actually tell you exactly what's going on in the sense that you don't actually get the figures. And I've been to prison a few times, as one or two of you may know. And one of the interesting things, if you go to prison is, you know, a lot of the prisoners are actually really experts on the legal system. And why are they experts on the legal system? Because that's what's actually controlling their lives. And when the penny drops that, you know, this situation is beyond bad, you want to know exactly how bad it is. So I'm just going to suggest a few things just to sort of settle us into why mobilization is important, and actually communicating what exactly is happening with the climate crisis is an essential initial element in actually mobilizing people. So, I mean, there's 101 ways of doing this, but the way I usually do it is by just producing what you might call killer facts, which is, you know, you can't deny them. They're like things that determine the whole system. So, you know, you can pick these out every other week, but I'll pick out a few facts which you may know about. But a scientific paper came out, for instance, like last week or the week before, I think, which said that the forest fires in Australia are going to be every year events within 20 years. So I'm 53, and I'm sure some of you are old enough to remember the year 2000. That's only 20 years ago. 20 years is not a long time. So basically what we're saying is in 20 years, within 20 years, then we're going to have massively disruptive forest fires in Australia, and by deduction, you can say in the United States as well. And what does that mean? Well, 20% of the forestry burned over the last 2 months. 50% of Australians had health effects from those fires. 1 billion animals died. There was massive dislocation, massive trauma. And imagine that happening on an average year in 20 years' time. And this is like one of the reasons why I need to give people these facts, because the penny needs to drop that this is absolutely real, it's absolutely coming down the line, and it's going to be absolute hell. That's the fundamental message. This isn't something about polar bears, it's not something distant, it's not about the environment, whatever the environment is. It's about our everyday lives. Another fact I'll give you, which is just coming through, as you might say, is that the independent institutes around the world are making a reassessment on how much the temperature is going to increase due to greenhouse gases being put into the air. Well, everyone's more or less got their head around the idea that if you put carbon into the air, the temperature increases. But obviously the name of the game is how much increases. So before the Industrial Revolution, there was 280 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And if we double that, that's 560 parts per million, right? And we're at 415 at the moment, going up about 3 or 4 parts per million a year. The basic maths is that we should be hitting 560 parts per million somewhere around the mid-century, 2050, maybe 2060. Anyway, it turns out that the original prediction was this would lead to about 3 degrees centigrade. The new calculations coming out of independent institutes in the UK and Europe, which are going to feed into the UN process in about a year's time, the prediction now is that it's going to be more like 5 degrees. And as I say, once you start getting into this, this is like a massive, massive change. It's a little bit like the 1.5 degrees that we can't go above that came out in October 2018. I'm sure many of you read that, and that was a catalyst around the world. It was like, oh my God, we've got 10 years left and what have you. Well, let me tell you, like 5 degrees centigrade, if you're not totally aware of that, actually means 10 degrees centigrade in the center of continents. And that's the average. So in other words, like 20, 30% of the time, it's going to be 20 degrees. In other words, you're not going to be able to grow food by the mid-century. If you can't grow food, then you don't need to be a farmer like me to realize that millions and potentially billions of people are going to starve to death. And one of the reasons I'm always nervous giving these talks is I always feel like completely inadequate in actually communicating the absolute enormity of what we're facing and how to communicate that. You know, we're not talking here about another sort of cozy, you know, identity politics, sectional sort of campaign. We're talking about something that's going to destroy the lives of everyone's children in the next generation. That's what we're talking about. And the important thing to communicate as well is that, and this is an essential part of the messaging for mobilization, I think, is this isn't about the environment. It's not about protecting the wildlife. Obviously, it's about that. But the fundamental messaging, the fundamental point here is it's about people's everyday lives. It's about the pensions they're going to lose. It's about the healthcare that's going to be destroyed. It's about the jobs that aren't going to exist in the first instance. And in the second instance, it's going to mean social breakdown. And this is the transition that Extinction Rebellion, I believe, has started to make. It hasn't done it in a very vigorous way, I have to say, in my view, because it's still full of middle-class euphemisms. I mean, what the hell does social breakdown mean? Well, we sort of know what it means. It means that our sons are going to be sent off to war to be slaughtered. Our daughters are going to be raped. It means there's going to be massive increases in crime. It's going to mean there's going to be no government agencies. There's a whole literature about it. And that's the hell that's coming. It's not going to be about something over there called the environment. It's going to be our worst possible nightmare. So, you know, when I did these talks, this is the moment, and I can sort of see it in your eyes, and I've done it like 100 times before. This is the point at which you sort of know what the climate crisis is, but then you've just realized what it is. It's not about the climate. It's about the breakdown of everything we love. It's about the betrayal of our children. It's about the betrayal of our most cherished values. And mobilization, I think, has to be based upon this fundamental realization of how totally fucked the situation is. And once people get that realization, obviously you're halfway there, right? And I'm going to tell you a little bit, I guess, about what comes next. So what I suggest comes next is rage and anger. And I think, like, looking at the history of social and political struggles, particularly over the last century, there's a sort of flip point, and it goes something like this. For a decade or two, or several decades, like, people have the idea that this is just happening. It's not like someone's particularly creating it. It's just the way it is. It's sad. It's unfortunate. It's something that we can send a few letters about, we can write to our representatives about. And then there's a certain point where people realize en masse that this is a deliberate and planned process of destroying our lives, our interests. And that's the point at which anger explodes. So I don't suppose I need to tell you, but like similar thing, this sort of thing happened in the late 1950s when Black communities in the American South decided they'd had enough of decades of playing it nice. They started to get into what happens when people get really angry and decide to do something. I've just watched this evening, like a video of the ACT UP movement in New York, the same sort of thing. People were getting AIDS, maybe it was just the way it is, and suddenly it dawns on people that there's a structural violence in so much as medicines weren't being provided. And I think at the moment, to be honest, we haven't got to that point of rage and anger, which is being expressed explicitly, but we're on the verge of it. And I think where it's going to come from, of course, is from the youth, because the youth are going to realize that this isn't just some unfortunate thing that's going to happen to them. It is something that is being enacted in a willing and conscious way, in full knowledge of the science which has been communicated for 30 years. In other words, people are planning the death of the next generation. It's as simple as that, because they don't want to be challenged and they don't want their interests to be questioned. Okay, so what that tradition leads to, and what a lot of researchers, including myself, have sort of clarified, is the most effective way to bring about political change in the shortest amount of time, which has a progressive outcome, is civil disobedience. I'm not going to talk enormously about it because I'm sure many of you, or even most of you in the audience, agree with this. However, there is civil disobedience and there's civil disobedience. In other words, there's ways to make it most effective. And this is where some of the challenge comes in, because a lot of the direct action over the next generation or two has been very well-meaning and often it's been very effective. But I would argue, on the basis of the research I've done and other people have done, is that civil resistance model, as you call it, is the most effective method of rapidly changing the whole of society in a short amount of time. And traditionally in the environmental movement, there's been a tendency to focus on the particular things that are going wrong, you know, like a particular coal plant or a particular pipeline or whatever. Now, I want to emphasize that's not necessarily a bad thing, as the person before mentioned about Canada. But what I would like to propose to you is that fundamental structural change will not happen until a critical mass, and that's like tens of thousands of people, blockade the centers of cities. And there's some particular reasons why that works. And one of the sort of evidence for this, a major part of the evidence for this, is based upon what's been happening on the global south for the last 50 or 100 years. In other words, the standard model of getting rid of the regime or fundamentally changing it is tens of thousands of people go to the capital city and they sit in the roads and they stay there day after day. And the reason for that, of course, is because it can't be ignored. Yeah, you know, particularly if it's a capital city. In other words, that's where the media is, and the media obviously is very important, but it's also where a lot of the public are. It's also where the government is, and it's also where the elites are. And the paper that I wrote in January last year, which basically formed the basis of this book, which is available for you to buy today, was a plan for the blockade of London in the UK for April last year. And thousands of people, on the basis of this strategy that I outlined last January, came down to London and they blockaded London for 10 days. It was like global news, and it transformed the conversation in the UK. Like hardly anyone really was bothered about climate change before, like 1,200 people arrested. And then afterwards, 67% of the British population agreed there was a climate emergency. There was a debate in Parliament, and the British government was the first British government to agree to the fact there's a climate emergency. And it was replicated, as I'm sure you know, in October. So last year, 3,000 people were arrested in the UK. That's the biggest series of civil disobedience actions in the whole of British history. And again, it's starting to translate into real action. Like just last week, Heathrow Airport, which was the biggest carbon-intensive infrastructure project in Europe, was cancelled by the judiciary and declared illegal and incompatible with the Paris Agreement. Now, that's nothing to do with the Paris Agreement, as judges have privately told us. It's everything to do with 3,000 people going through the judicial system and the whole court system being massively clogged up with people saying, you know, if I need to get arrested, then so be it. So, yeah, so what this leads me on to my main sort of argument, I suppose, which is about mobilization. I think I had a chat with some like Australian Extinction Rebellion people earlier in the week, and they were saying like, there comes a certain point where you don't actually really want to know anymore how bad it is. You want to know what to do about it. And I think in social movements, this is a critical point, and maybe that's why you've come tonight, is there's only so much you can read and experience before you get to that point where you actually become serious. And by becoming serious, what I mean by that is the question is not why things are bad, but what are we going to do? When things become serious, that's the fundamental question. What are we going to do? And the message I guess I've got on this, and this sounds like really basic, but I'm trying to make it basic, is that it's a numbers game, right? In other words, it's all about how many people go into rebellion against the government. It's the same like as a labour strike. It's basically a material analysis. Everyone knows labour strikes work. They don't always work, but we know why they work. The reason why they work is because a critical mass of workers go on strike at the same time. In other words, it's the material power of withdrawing your labour. And everyone knows there's a certain point at which the bosses will come and negotiate. And the name of the game is to get enough workers to go on strike for long enough. That's the basic gist. And often that doesn't happen, but often it does. And as we all know, it's been a major mechanism through which the working class has promoted its interests since the 1880s, when it was discovered as a tactic. So my suggestion to you guys is that this is similar in terms of the civil resistance model. Instead of having a workplace that you go on strike, you basically go to the city and you close that city down. And that's all about the numbers. Now, we've been told, for instance, by various intelligence sources, as the euphemism goes, that there's a certain point at which the police in London will not be able to cope with a certain number of arrests. And we know what that number is. I'm not going to tell you the number for certain reasons, but I can tell you it's graspable, right? It's not like 100,000 arrests. It's many, many times less. I don't know what it is in New York, and I don't know what it is in Washington. But what I do know is that number exists. And when that amount of disruption happens, then you'll find change happens. And that's what we need to do. So how do we create mass mobilization? This is the last thing I'll talk about, and then I'll take some questions. So one of the things that I've been sort of working on in the UK there's a sort of boring backroom issue of how to actually get people into a headspace in order for them to feel okay about sitting on the road. That's bluntly what the project is. And the first thing I want to mention, and this is challenging, I think, to a lot of social movements, but I'm going to say what it is anyway, is it's absolutely essential that if you're going to build a social movement, you create a welcoming culture. And it's important to understand what a welcoming culture means. Specifically means when people walk into the room in your meeting, someone goes up to them and talks to them on one-to-one. It's these little things that make people feel like this is an environment, this is a culture, this is a group of people that I want to be part of. It means having like drinks and biscuits and what have you on the tables. It means having breakout groups so people can talk to each other, because the act of speech encourages people to feel welcome. It means that people check up on each other afterwards. In other words, people mobilize due to sociability. They obviously mobilize because they've got the facts. They also mobilize because they're angry. But a fundamental determinant is, are they actually feeling okay in this space? And that means people basically being nice to each other, not judging each other and saying, yeah, that person isn't that much like me, but we're all working together. And there's ways and means of doing that, such as reading out respect statements and what have you at the beginning of meetings. And Extinction Rebellion, and I think this is one of the most underestimated sort of aspects to it, Extinction Rebellion is really based upon a new way of organising, which is based upon welcoming people who aren't like us. And that's how I think it's grown to 200 groups in a population of 50 million. So there's 200,000 people now involved in Extinction Rebellion in the UK on various levels. And there's 50 million people. So that's the equivalent for the US of about 1.2 million. So that's like what you might call what it looks like when we do mass mobilization. The other thing I want to emphasize is this idea of getting out of your silo. And this seems to be an enormous headache for a lot of extinction groups around the world. And I think that's because there's this idea that you create a social movement and you create it from people that are like you. And obviously it's nice to be there with people like you. But the essential thing to understand about the climate crisis, or the crisis as I call it, is it's a fundamentally universal concern to everybody in a way that it wasn't 20 years ago. In other words, I can more or less guarantee that you can go to any town around New York, you can do this talk, the Heading for Extinction talk, and you can create an Extinction Rebellion chapter or group. And what we've been developing in the UK is a systematic way of approaching this. In other words, instead of just leaving it to chance that, someone rings up from Albany or, from another town or city in New York State, what you do is you sit down with a map and you split the state into 50 different boroughs or districts, and you systematically hold a talk in every borough. And you create 50 groups in New York State in 3 months. That's what's being done in the UK. And this basically means getting out and talking to ordinary people, which is very difficult, right? So, I've been organising people since I was 15. So I've been going to lots of meetings where there's only 2 people in the room, right? So what this requires is a lot of persistence. When we started off Extinction Rebellion, a lot of people thought, well, that's a really ridiculous idea, as you can imagine. And I organised a meeting in Nottingham, and 3 people turned up, my mate and 2 of his friends. And it'd be very easy to say, write Nottingham off and say, oh, I don't want to do that there. But what we did is one of those people knew a whole load of other people in Nottingham, and we held a meeting 3 weeks later, and 30 people turned up. And now there's 1,000 people in Nottingham on the list of Extinction Rebellion or thereabouts. So it takes persistence, but the fundamental point is we're all human. Everyone cares about their children. Everyone cares about their families, their communities, and the nation. These are universal themes. And what we're finding is People never heard of the Green Movement or the environmental movement, or some of the people who are coming forward to be arrested. And they're coming forward to be arrested because they're concerned about those fundamental things, their children, their family, and their communities. All right. How am I doing? Yeah. Okay, I'm going to finish off. Is everyone still there? I'm just looking at this picture.
We're here.
It's not all cardboard cutouts.
Only some of
great.
us.
All right, well, I'm going to finish off with my final proposition, which always confuses some people because it basically contradicts a lot of the things I've said. But this is probably the deepest thing I'm going to say, but it's really supported by a lot of the sociological evidence, as you might say. And that's this paradox of wanting to see success. And it goes a bit like this, is the people traditionally that have driven political change have not been primarily interested in whether they're successful or not. And so that's quite strange, but this is basically traditionally what rebels in history have done. They basically rebelled because they're rebels, because they can't stand to live with themselves and not rebel. Or, you know, the situation is so intolerable that they're going to resist anyway. And the paradox of this is that this enables people to become sustainable. So, as some of you may know, like I was involved in a very rapid campaign at King's College in London. And as you may know, there's been a lot of fossil fuel divestment campaigns. And, you know, they usually go on for 2, 3, 4 years, people sitting on committees, you know, doing petitions and what have you. And interestingly enough, I went to the group that was involved in it and said, well, have you done direct action? And they said no. And I said, well, why don't we try that? And they didn't really want to do it. So I set up this very small campaign, and it involved causing £7,000 worth of damage to King's College's central hall through chalking it with spray chalk. And that was sort of interesting. That got quite a lot of attention, as you can imagine. And then I went on a 14-day hunger strike. And then within 5 weeks, the whole college had agreed to divest. So instead of taking like 5 years, it took 5 weeks. So that's a central bit of evidence, as you might say, that direct action works. Well, the main point I want to communicate is the only way that I had the courage to do that was by accepting that I could have well be suspended and end up back on my farm weeding the spinach, as it were. In other words, I was only able to get that together by accepting I could be unsuccessful. And this is one of the biggest takeaways, I think, of people that change the world. People that change the world are not primarily interested in changing the world. What they're interested in is leading a life of integrity. In other words, like if King's College wasn't going to divest, I didn't even want to be in King's College, right? I was over it. In other words, like I was prepared to be suspended, and I was suspended as it happens for 10 days, and then they changed their mind. But that's really what it takes. And what I want to finish on, I suppose, is something I talked about in Zurich, and you can look me up, where I took my shirt off. I'm not going to take my shirt off, but is about courage. And this is the central message, I guess, is that nothing's going to change until all of you guys and many people like you have the courage to make that step into rebellion. And courage is not about overcoming fear. Courage is realizing there's something more important than fear. And with that note, I'll finish, and thank you for listening to me.
We have a lot of questions, and we were going to do a run of show where we had some testimonials from local XR rebels. But we know that it's the middle of the night for you, and we can do those testimonials a bit later and do the questions first. How much time are you able to give us, Roger?
Yeah. Well, I'm, dare I say it, I'm totally committed to the process. So I'm still here at 4 o'clock in the morning. That's fine by me. Having said that, feel free to go home.
I've got about 9 or 10 questions here, and they keep coming. So I'm going to just pick one. I'm just going to pick one at a time, sort of random, okay? How do you help people make that transition from understanding the scale of the problem to actually committing to and taking action? Specifically, what happens, what's the process in someone's mind and body that speak from your personal experience or what you've observed?
Well, before I answer the questions, let me just say, just to re-emphasize again, right? Dare I say, I'm not God, just in case you haven't noticed, right? There's a whole number of ways of dealing with these sort of problems, and I'm obviously I've done research on it, and I've been responsible with others in building this social movement. And this social movement came about through systematic research on what works. But having said that, what we're dealing with here is not, this isn't about starting a car engine. Do you understand what I mean? We're talking about probability analysis. In other words, like, I can give you a bunch of routines, but there's no absolute guarantee. All I'm trying to promote is the idea that these are more likely to work than alternatives. So, bear that in mind and feel free to disagree with me and what have you. So, having said that, as I understand it, the question is, what's the process from someone understanding the situation through to taking action? Is that right?
You spoke a bit before about being a rebel and being a person of integrity, and this question comes from a place that is more sort of psychological. What's it like to make the transition? You talked a little bit about people who are not motivated to be successful, but are just motivated to live a life of integrity and have nothing left to lose. Perhaps someone's asking a question about what that feels like, and how do you prepare yourself to put down the things that you used to value about yourself and your value in society, and move into a real definition of yourself as having usefulness to the planet and to life. If that's any help at all, I might have just made this more confusing.
Well, I can make 2 points about it, I guess, which is we live in a culture, I think, where we've been told, and if I wanted to get intellectual, I'd say this goes back to the Enlightenment, which is this idea that we sit around, you're sitting in your chairs at the moment, and the idea is you're thinking about, what you should do and what you shouldn't do, and whether this guy is, a bit out there or not, and all this sort of stuff. And the fact of the matter is, what you are individually thinking is really not that important in the wider scheme of things. And that's a real bit of a blow to all our egos, as you can imagine. But I think there's 2 things that influence whether we take action. And one of the first thing, I guess, is what other people are doing around us and how much support we have. And this is one of the big things that we try to develop in Extinction Rebellion, is we're all crew. So whatever you decide to do, whether you decide you're able to put yourself into a position of arrest or not, everyone's there to support each other. And this is absolutely fundamental, unless you're some extraordinary individual. We all need love and attention. And if we don't get it, then we're useless. We just turn inward, or we turn bitter, and all the rest of it. So it's essential that people create affinity groups, for instance, and once you decide to take action with other people, then you're far more likely to do it if you're in that group. So that's one thing. The other thing is that action creates action, and this is another really big problem with a lot of social movements, is they think they have to mobilize and then they're going to take an action. I'm sure you've had that discussion if you're in one of the groups. It's like, well, we won't sit in the row because there's only 5 of us, sort of thing, right? The fact of the matter is, it's action that creates mobilization. This happens over and over again. For instance, when I sprayed chalk to King's College and went on hunger strike. But basically, that campaign started with about 4 people, or 2 people initially. But once we'd created the action, then about 500 people got involved in the campaign. So if we'd been waiting for those 500 people, we'd never have actually got going, right? Because these people would never have appeared. What you have to do is go out and do this prophetic action, as you might call it, you know, without any thought about whether you're going to be successful. And you'll find lots of people come out of the woodwork because they're impressed with your sacrifice and your dedication. And if I was going to be going around the States, I'd be going around with this guy, this 20-year-old guy called Gio. I don't know if any of you know about this guy, but he went on a hunger strike in Washington, D.C. and, you know, just by himself. So it was a bit of a sort of fuck it sort of thing, I think. Just said, I'm just going to do this. So this is like classic rebel sort of activity. You just go and do it. And then it caught the imagination. And I spoke to him. I saw it in The Guardian in the UK. I got in touch with him and I said, what you're doing is great. And, you know, I want to support you. And I do this sort of thing behind the scenes quite a lot. And we set up some sort of infrastructure with him. And within 2 or 3 months, I think, and basically 2,000 people around the world were going on hunger strike, you know, in a symbolic way for 2 or 3 weeks and what have you. And it's going to happen again in April and, you know, maybe 10,000 people. So the most important thing to enable people to make that transition to action is not to do loads of talks like mine, although obviously that's important. It's actually to just go and do it and then build from there. So I don't know if that's the right sort of answer, but there's 2 points there anyway.
My takeaway from that is, and I'm not going to get the accent right, fuck it. It's the spirit of fuck it. All right, I don't think we're going to get to these all, even though you did say you would be up until 4 in the morning. We're in the capital region. We're not a capital city, despite us being called the capital region. We're the capital of New York State, not a capital of the nation. What do you think that local groups such as us, and you're talking about just going out to 50 different districts of New York, for example, what are we meant to being accomplished in a small city or a rural area? And kind of a related question that people in XR here are thinking about discrete local actions, you know, in solidarity with other groups against a pipeline or fracking, but these are not necessarily the mass actions in large cities. So talk to us a little bit about that, if you can. What should we be doing here, Roger?
Well, again, you know, like I'm going to give you some broad principles, and I mean that these are broad principles. So it's not like there's some dedicated and mechanical process out there that can be brought down and, you know, guaranteed to work. So it's up to you how you interpret it, what I say. But I think historically, when people get serious, they really get serious about how to actually win, which of course is a bit paradoxical because I've said, you know, people aren't that concerned about winning as well. But it is possible to do both. Like, you know, I get up at 8 o'clock in the morning and I work 13 hours a day and been doing it for 2 or 3 years. And everything I'm dedicated towards is this question: how are we going to maximize the probability of winning on this? Because there doesn't seem to be anything more important, right? When I actually go out and act, I give all that up and I accept it. I might not be successful. And I think, like, historically, when people get really desperate, as it were, and really angry, then they start seriously thinking about what it actually means to win. And I think traditionally a lot of social movements, particularly in the Western world, like settle for what you might call symbolic success. And the environmental movement traditionally has been really heavy on symbolic success. You know, symbolic success is a bit like, you know, the UN makes a statement because you had a rally, you know, 100,000 people walk in New York and it goes in the papers and then nothing happens the following day. You know, you can do a rally in Albany or whatever, and everyone feels good about themselves, and not much is going to happen. Now, I'm not saying all those things don't have some functionality. Obviously, they do. And the functionality that they have is what in the trade is called movement building. In other words, like someone's not going to transition from, going to a meeting in some small industrial town in New York State, never been involved with activism, to, going to prison or whatever it is in 2 weeks. What people need to do is they need to put they need to be involved in small actions which don't necessarily have a high risk. So it's perfectly legitimate and necessary to do these smaller actions, but it's important to understand what they're there for. What they're there for is to build the movement, to build some resilience, so affinity groups and what have you can get used to working together and all that. But the real prize and what's called the sort of non-linearity of political change, in other words, like getting to something where you get a big win, is all about mass action in cities. And as I said, in my talk, there's some specific reasons for that, because that's where the media is, that's where the elites are, that's where the governing institutions are. Now, that can be interpreted in a number of different ways in a US context, of course, because there's Washington, D.C., and then the state capitals. So there's, some strategic discussion around that. But the fundamental structural point is this is what happens when people get really serious. In other words, like, as I said, I've been doing some work on ACT UP. ACT UP could have been going, well, the bad stuff's happening in the hospitals, so we're going to have a rally outside the hospital. But what they didn't do that. They did that, but the main things they did was go and occupy the cathedral in New York, right? What they did is they closed down the stock exchange. What they did is they went to the newspapers and the radio stations and the TV stations and closed them down, right? None of them had a direct relationship with hospitals and medical issues. So it's the same thing with the climate, is you need to close down the fundamental, parts of the economy. And that sounds really harsh, of course, and it's not going to be pretty and there's no pressure. But as a sociologist of political change, that's how it works, is by people getting serious because they're so angry and are saying, whatever it takes, we're going to go into New York and we're going to stay there and all the rest of it. So, there's lots of discussion around when that should happen and what have you. My personal view is once you have 500 people that are prepared to be arrested, then that's the point to go to the state capital. And then you build on that. And 3 months later, you come back, and 3 months later, you come back. So, that's an outline. Could be wrong, but that seems to be the way it works.
I've got a few more questions. I'm going to just pick two that seem to be related, and this will be your last question, and then we'll go into testimonials. And I apologize to people in the audience if not everything comes up. These are kind of two related questions and a segue out of what you were just speaking to. There's a question that says, what works to, it's about resilience and movement building. What works to keep people who are very different together, focused, committed, and active? What organizing strategies work best? And I think a related question to that is the following of this organization appears to be predominantly white. And is this, what strategies are we implementing to be ready to bridge across that divide, especially given that Indigenous people and people of color are disproportionately affected by the crisis? So movement building, inclusivity, and keeping people together.
Well, the first thing to say about this is it's very difficult. Otherwise, it would have been achieved. So what I'm going to say as a sort of preface, my answers to the other questions is, these things aren't necessarily easy, but there's some orientations that seem to work better than other orientations, let's put it like that. And I come back and I say this over and over again, that solidarity doesn't really mean anything if it means you can't communicate in a kind way, right? You know, human beings, as I said, are primarily social. They're only going to enter your space if they feel welcomed. And that sort of welcoming culture tends to trump culture or political background or class background or racial differences. There's no absolute guarantee, and it doesn't mean it's not so easy. But this can be institutionalized, and it's the institutionalization in practice that creates inclusiveness. And this is why I tend to focus personally in my answers to these questions on practices rather than sort of generalized commitments to inclusivity and solidarity and all these words which sound great, but at the end of the day, what do they actually mean? So as I said, you know, one of the things which is really important is welcoming people into the room. Can't be underestimated. Usually from a psychological point of view, you sort of decide whether you like something or not in the first 2 minutes. And, you know, after that, it's very difficult to shift people's perceptions. So that's one of the things. Another thing that's so important when you're building a social movement is to create environments where people can engage in the act of speech. And this can be institutionalized by having breakout groups, which obviously we haven't really had tonight, so I'm sort of contradicting myself. But ideally, if I was there, I'd split everyone into groups of 4 and everyone could talk about it, because it's through talking about it that people get empowered. And another thing is having a respect statement. And this has been enormously powerful in the UK, that a statement is read out to say that we're here to listen to each other and respect each other, not to call out and to resolve our conflicts in a non-violent way outside the particular space of the meeting and what have you. And that's created us what you might call a respect discipline, because as we all know, you can sit in meetings and people understandably get high rate and what have you. And then another way is trying to institute that listening culture. So one of the things we do quite a lot in the UK is, you know, people speak and then someone will summarize what they've said. I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of these techniques, but they need to be instituted in a vigorous way in order to maintain some cohesion in groups where people are from different backgrounds. But the other thing to say is at the end of the day, a lot of this comes down to how serious people are about how terrible the reality is. And this is when social movements become rebellions, as it were, when people do start working together with other people that don't particularly see eye to eye to, is there's basically a bigger picture. And this is one of the things I was going to say to people in the States, you know, if I actually got there, is, yeah, you know, Extinction Rebellion's got lots of problems, and all social movements have got lots of problems. But where are you going after you decided Extinction Rebellion isn't good enough? You know, it's like there's no safe options anymore. There's no sort of, you know, go away and the world will carry on as it is. You know, we're in a terribly dangerous situation. So sure, you know, if a particular Extinction Rebellion group or any social movement group isn't working for you, then go and set up your own. But, you know, withdrawing from the process is no solution. The other thing I would say is again, like in terms of engaging with poorer or more marginalized communities and what have you, at the end of the day, you have to go into those communities and say your truth. And, you know, this is difficult if you've come from a more privileged background. But at the end of the day, you just have to take that on the chin, that some people will give you a hard time. There's always people that give each other a hard time for very good reasons often. But what we've tried to do in Extinction Rebellion, and we're doing this at the moment, is choose those areas of cities, the more working class areas of cities, and go in and do the extinction talk. And my experience is, as long as you're not trying to patronize or talk down to people, you know, the facts basically speak for themselves, and you will find people wanting to mobilize and join and collaborate, as it were, from more marginalized groups, or whatever words you want to use for those groups, working class groups, if you go in with some humility, speak your own truth, and then give people the option to decide what to do afterwards. So that's the challenge. I'm not pretending it's not a great challenge, but I think it's the challenge which can be overcome because, as I said, the fundamental thing is this affects everybody, and yeah, everyone wants their kids to have an okay life, right? So.
Thank you, Roger. I do want to add that when after Roger's gone to bed at some point, I hope you will decide that it's time to go to bed. We're going, and after we do our testimonials, there will be some time for all of us to break into small groups and kind of process and talk about what, if you'd care to stick around, so that we're not just throwing you back out into the streets tonight rather abruptly. But thank you so much, Roger.
That's a good idea.
It wasn't my idea, so thank you, the person whose idea it was. We've still got about 15 or 20 minutes before the event originally scheduled wrap time. So I'd like to do some shout outs and give some time to speak to people who were very active in Extinction Rebellion here in the Capital Region. And I'm going to call them up and give them each some time to be heard and talk to those who are assembled here tonight about what it's like to be active here and why you're doing it, how serious you are. Let's be serious, but in a rebellious and fun way, but let's be serious. So Alison, you're first on the list. Come up and speak to us. And you've got a mark over here to be properly lit.
Man, this is fancy. Hello. I didn't realize I was going to have a mark and a spotlight and everything. This is good. This is good. So you saw me in the beginning video getting arrested at the controller's office, and that probably seems like I've been doing this forever, but I actually just heard about Extinction Rebellion maybe 2 weeks before that action. So I just want to tell you a little bit about what my thought process was when I heard about it, why I jumped in so quickly, and why I'm really glad I did. Thank you. So the big thing for me is that Extinction Rebellion has helped to answer the question of what next. And what I mean by that is when I saw the talk, the Heading for Extinction talk, that was the first time I heard of them. That was about 2 weeks before the action. And I almost didn't go to it because we all know that there's a climate crisis. We all know that we're in trouble. We know this. Like, I didn't expect to hear anything new. You know, you go to the climate strike like I did last year, and then afterwards you're sitting there thinking, okay, that was cool, but what next? And, you know, I was expecting to go in here, maybe, here's these problems we have, let's all recycle more. But we don't need to raise more awareness at this point. We all know, but we need the what next, and I feel like not many of us have that question answered. And so for me, when I went to the talk, what I heard that I wasn't expecting to hear was actual facts of other rebellious movements that have been successful. I heard historical precedents for the type of thing that we're trying to do here, and research and data. And I'm a professor, so I'm really excited about research and data. And so that was something that clicked for me of like, okay, there's a plan. It's not just raising awareness. We're all aware, but here's a plan. Here's a question, the question I've had of what next that they're actually answering. Here's the plan of action we can take. They have, you know, that 3.5% figure that I keep hearing. The first time I heard that, it didn't even really sink in until I thought about it and heard it a few more times, where like, we know not only is there a plan, but we know exactly what the goal is. The goal is 3.5%. If we get there, we're solid, basically. And so that was so exciting for me. So I went to the Nonviolent direct action training that was the following week. And when I came for the data, I stayed for the community, because as soon as I walked into that room at the training, I just felt so welcome. And you heard Roger talk a bit about that welcoming atmosphere and how you have to go up and greet people right away. And that is not just talk, because as it was a room of maybe 20 strangers, and I sat down with them and just felt at home. And we really connected, and I've checked out other groups. I've tried, I drove like 2 hours to get to a meeting of an anarchist group once that I thought might be good, and I just didn't I just left feeling just as hopeless as when I went in, and like nobody even tried to connect. And the connection answered that question again of what next. So the first step is we're taking these actions, we have the research to back up that this is the right course of action, the most likely to succeed. But then what next after we take that action? If we succeed, well, what next then is we're already building those community connections. And so at the same time, while we're here trying to basically tear down a system, there's already an idea for the system that we need to build to replace it with the community support and connections and networking. And to me, that's just something I'm so excited to be a part of. And so when I did that first action, first for me, with Extinction Rebellion, a couple weeks ago now, at that action, so I was one of the people who went in knowing I was probably going to get arrested and did get arrested, but it wasn't even scary, it was just energizing. It was hopeful, it was powerful. I knew there were people looking out for me, and I knew exactly who those people were, and I knew that if anything went wrong, they would be there, they would be on the phone right away on my behalf. There were people waiting to feed me and take care of my needs afterwards, and make sure, I was giving something and they were giving something to me. And not everybody even has to be there physically putting your body in the way, because every part really is so important. And just if your part is building that community, then that's amazing too. And yeah, that's what I'm doing now, and I'm really excited to be doing it, and I hope some of you do it with us.
Thanks, Allison. Speaking of serious, Christian, serious dude, come up here and talk to us about what it's like to be in Extinction Rebellion.
My name's Christian. I'm an arborist, tree hugger type. I didn't give it, once I found out about all the information, I didn't give it much thought. I've got 2 little kids. I have a recently kindled love affair with the earth and all that she provides, so I was pretty pissed that all this was going to be taken away from me and from future generations. So I decided to go down to New York City for the October Rebellion and take a hit, and like Allison said, it was energizing. It was good fun. I plan on doing it again. Hope to see more of you doing it with us or playing support roles and all that. I wanted to tell a quick story for a bunch of reasons, but it'll be quick. I don't remember where I heard this story. I don't remember if it's actually true or if it's just like a fable, but there were these 2 researchers decades ago, scientists that went to some remote, let's say, Amazonian village to study the behavior of one of the tribes there. And they're real deep, days journey away from any services. One of the researchers gets real sick. They don't know what to do. They start the journey back to get him to the hospital. His buddy, who's a good friend of his and the co-researcher, they're on their way back, and he's freaking out that his friend is going to die. What is he going to tell his family? All this stress on this boat ride, and the tribes people that were coming with him were just laughing and in jovial spirits the whole time. And there was this. They had no way of translating back then, so they get the guy help. He ends up surviving. Decades later, they make it back to the place to visit the tribe again. This time they have a translator. The one guy who was freaking out, he brings it up to them and he said, "Hey, what was up with you guys, making fun of him when he was dying?" And they said, "Well, didn't you were killing him with your energy. We were trying to keep him alive, right?" So, hopefully that sits with you a bit. But basically what this comes down to is I believe that the earth is alive. She's being slaughtered wholesale, right? And that's part of why I'm in this. The other message from that is to take a cue from the natives, right, and the old wisdom, because that worrying and all that fear is more part of the old story, right, call it the patriarchy, whatever, that's being smashed right now. And this mass mobilization is the way that we're going to enjoy ourselves, even if it doesn't look like traditional enjoyment. That's the energy we're bringing forth in bringing about the new story, where we're going to love the earth and take care of one another and really embrace what it means to be human. So yeah, that is what we're doing, and I really hope that more and more people will join us, because like Roger was talking about, the number of people that will just break the police system, it would be really awesome if we could like live to see that day where the cops were just like, I don't know, I don't think we got it in us. So I hope I motivated you somewhat, because that's what I was told to do. Thanks.
Very motivating. We're very proud we got 11 people arrested at the controller's office, because it's said that it's very, very difficult to get arrested in Albany, because everybody protests here and the police are told not to arrest anybody. So we were pretty excited when it started happening. I'm going to call Megan and come up here. You're both Sanctuary and XR, which is turning into a beautiful collaboration here. So speak to us about your life as a rebel.
X marks the spot here. Okay. Allison kind of inspired me because it was something you said about going to the climate march and perceptions. And I think for a lot of people, 2019 was the year that people started to get it. And I know in my own story, a lot of things in my own personal story motivated me to become politically active when I was like 19. I remember going into the computer lab at school and seeing that Bill Clinton had ordered the bombing of UN clean water pipelines in Iraq. And then I was like, okay, something's going on. And then that was the event that kind of triggered me going to different protests, protesting the Iraq war. And what's terrifyingly, horrifyingly interesting to me about the climate crisis is that it's the all-encompassing nature of everything. So like, you know, you'd go to a protest back in 2003 to think that you could stop the Iraq war, and then life could get back to normal. And in some ways, I almost have gratitude over the fact that the enormity of this crisis makes us feel like we do have to face that these systems that we've inhabited have always been wrong. And a person in XR tonight, Sarah, taught me the word omnicidal, this whole idea that what's happening with the climate is all killing, you know. It's killing everything, it's all encompassing. And so in the past couple of years, I've had to make the move from you can go to this protest or you can do this action to this idea of like, we really truly have nothing to lose in terms of doing anything about this. So I would encourage you definitely to join. I'm an English teacher. I remember like getting involved in environmental stuff and being like, why should I be involved? As someone who doesn't have a scientific background explicitly, but we're at the point where everyone is needed, obviously. And we also desperately need each other. We need compassion and also reality foundation making, because it takes a lot to process a fact like we might be at 5 degrees this soon, or it takes a lot to process the fact that you know, sea levels are going to rise 130 feet. So I need people around me to say, you're not crazy. This is like, these are incredibly hard things to be carrying around personally. So I deeply appreciate the community factor of XR, and I hope that you join.
Rachel, you want to come up? Hello, everybody. I'm kind of one of the newest members to XR. I haven't gone on an action or done anything. I've been in it for like less than a month, I guess. But what inspired me is I was kind of really depressed and like really just fucking felt so alone. Like I would sign my petitions online and be like, I guess I'm doing something, but I kind of had lost faith in everyone and everything. And then I actually saw, like on Facebook and social media, the action that they had done at the comptrollers, and I was like, fuck, here it is. Like, this is what we need. Like, this is what I've been looking for. Like, we need these people to, like, we need to be in the streets. We need this civil disobedience. And I was like, I gotta, like, who are they? What are they? Like, I just, like, started, like, ingesting, like, everything that I could. I went to the Heading for Extinction talk, and then I went to a monthly meeting, and then I was like, why am I, and every time I would go, I'd be like, why am I doing this? Why am I doing, like, I would drive there, and I'd be like, I could just go to Goodwill, I could do something else, like, and then I would, like, make myself go, and then I would be like, holy fuck, like, I was so inspired every time I went, and when I went to the monthly meeting, like, we broke out into little groups, and, like, they wanted to hear what I had to say, and I was like, you don't even know who I am, and they're like, that's great. We need to know from people who we don't know. So I'm really excited about everything, and I hope that you guys can also get excited that there is hope in something and that we're not just spiraling to nothingness, that if we stand together and we build this community, like, we will have something for everybody. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone for coming and listening to me and to the testimonials. And I mean, the thing that sort of springs out to me is, and it's quite a surreal feeling, is to know that there's meetings like this happening all around the world at the moment. Extinction Rebellion's in 70 countries, and it's quite weird to think that it started off with me and 15 people in a cafe. So it sort of feels like anything's possible if there's people all around the whole of this planet in rooms like you're in at the moment, hearing testimonials about people getting arrested. So you're not alone, and best of luck. Thanks.
Thank you.